Welcome back to the History of the Papacy Podcast, a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. Hey, welcome back, everybody. I am really excited today. We have a very special guest, Greg Gassman. He is the host of the Popeular Podcast, and we've been trying to get this collaboration going for a long time, but it's finally happened today, and I am really excited to talk about, we're going to talk about podcasting, popecasting, everything popes, get to know Greg a little bit, and then have a little bit of an episode about a pope, believe it or not.
Yes. And the email chain, I was looking at it. I actually went ahead and resurrected the email chain when I first reached out, when I was first looking at podcasting. So it's nearly 5 years old, although obviously most of that activity is more recent with some of the recent news. So we were talking about doing like a prequel sort of thing.
So, Greg, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, a little about your podcast, your podcasting journey?
Yeah. So obviously my name is Greg. I'm a father of 5, which has certainly helped inform my podcasting journey, in part by making it kind of sporadic. I've had about as much hiatus as I have active show. But that was to be expected. I kind of knew that going in. I decided, family was going to be the first priority, and just let this be a hobby. I was aware enough from the podcasting community to know this was not going to be a bread and butter sort of thing. The fact that I can, pay for itself with helping other people edit their shows is plenty enough for me. Frankly, that's exceeded my expectations. But I started podcasting about 5 years ago with Popeular History. I reached out to several folks at the time for, a little bit of a guidance and just sort of that mental, just affirmation of I am, here. I can kind of sit with the rest of the class. Although with podcasting, it's interesting because, we're all both teachers and students kind of at the same time. So I appreciate you kind of responding with some early encouragement, Steve. And Gary Stevens, who I know you know well, was also encouraging. So, yeah, I have since branched out a little bit. I got pretty close to the Pontifax folks, Bree and Fry, with the aforementioned editing. And from that, I sort of decided to riff a little bit off of their format with ranking the popes with what they call a Rexipod. And so I came up with cardinal numbers, which is ranking all of the cardinals of the Catholic Church from the catacombs to kingdom come. So people thought that, ranking all the popes was crazy. Well, I decided to go ahead and say, well, hold my beer, right? Or hold my communion wine. Probably a little bit irreverent. I can make such jokes, though, because I am what's called a cradle Catholic. I grew up in the faith, and I still do practice. One day I'll get decent at it, but until then, I just keep practicing. But yes, obviously that kind of informs things. So I like to kind of mention that as sort of a full disclosure aspect. And then I've got, a variety of other things that I'm looking to get into as I sort of expand and build sort of the popular universe. You know how that goes, Steve.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to me, the Pope was kind of the hook. And then because I think church history was always what I really wanted to get into. And the popes is like the opening gambit. You can get into anything. If you start with the popes, you can go in any direction you want to. Like in the last year, I don't think I've put out one episode about the actual popes, and everything else has been about Solomon's Temple. Like you, I had a kind of a podcast hiatus. So my podcasting's been a little bit sporadic. I have a plan, a best laid plan to publish more frequently, but it's still, I actually do have a series coming up, and this might be kind of a collaboration possibility, is American History and the Popes, Catholic Church history, strictly focused on U.S. history. And I've set myself very strict timelines. I'm going to talk only about 1776 to the Civil War, U.S. Catholic history.
Yes. Do you know, and you can always edit this out if you want to keep it a surprise for your audience, but do you know the first time the Pope was officially welcomed to the U.S.?
Oh my goodness, I do know this from the series that I did.
Oh, that's right.
Previously, but I can't remember.
Yes, it was Pius IX coming aboard the USS Constitution as he was fleeing from one of the various, whatever the term is, uprisings in Rome through the years. So, yes, that's sort of a gotcha question because he was still obviously in Europe, but yes, formerly under your U.S. jurisdiction because Europe was a little too hot at the moment.
Yeah. So speaking of popes, and especially somebody, I would say Pope Francis is as transformative and transformational as Pius IX. And he's going to be the topic of our day today. We're going to really try to avoid a retrospective. I think this is a good time to talk about who is Pope Francis, because I think he hit the scene. And I don't know, as a Catholic, even just to kind of set the scene a little bit, what did you think when he was elected?
So Pope Francis's election is when I really got my own confidence as a Catholic commentator, because I do, if I say so myself, feel like I knocked it out of the park with just kind of knowing the little bit that I knew that, most anybody that wasn't, previously associated with him or kind of knew him before, you just had these little details, right? He was a South American and a Jesuit. And from that, I said, well, I expect we'll see, a focus on kind of social justice and the poor. And that is definitely, those are kind of drums that Pope Francis very much likes to beat, as it were. So that was sort of my initial guess, and it certainly seems to have carried through.
At that time, did you think in 2014, that it was 2013, that was he on your radar? Was he in your top 10 going into the conclave? Was he on your radar at all?
So it's funny because I had one of the B cardinals, so I got the first letter right. And sometimes I conflate the 2005 with 2013. So if someone, looks back and like, oh no, this guy was dead by that point, he probably was, my bad. But I believe the one that I was expecting, when people were making me guess, first off, I knew I didn't know. So I would have been shocked if I had gotten it right. But the name that I was throwing out at the time was actually an Italian, because I figured they'd probably go back to that side of things. And as we'll see, Pope Francis actually can be described as an Italian. He's, all of his ancestors, that he traces back came from Italy. They just happened to all end up in Argentina. But the cardinal that I was looking at the time, I'm going to talk about, was Cardinal Bagnosco, was the one that I was trying to, win informal non-monetary betting pools with.
It's so difficult to figure out who it would be, because when they go into the conclave, that seems to take a whole life of its own. I think that they probably don't really know who's going in, who's going to come out. Oh yeah, and to hear them talk about it, they certainly kind of echo that same thought, like, we really don't have, a lot of preferred, thoughts. Like, yes, people have their ideas in their head. And sometimes I do wonder, how much of this is sort of playing to the expectations of, oh, we don't really do politics here. This is the Vatican. But also, you do see, it does take multiple ballots, and the way that these votes, the amount of effort that goes into them, you're sitting there thinking, you're a
a guy at this point who's past retirement age for most professions, I don't feel like you're going to sit there through, even 2-3 days of balloting just to kind of, for the sake of appearances. So I do think there is genuine, just discussions, as much as people sort of like to look conspiratorially at it. It doesn't usually take as long as it once did. There was a time, when it would take years before they started doing this conclave process, which really was designed to help tighten it up, right? They used to basically have them on bread and water after they couldn't produce results. It's a little nicer now, but it is still quite the process, even for someone used to long ceremonies as any cardinals would be. It strikes me as something that would be very much a watching paint dry, despite the magnitude of the moment. I don't know. Well, obviously, I do know for sure you remember, Steve, because I remember you talking about it live at the time, kind of the resignation of Pope Benedict. And that had come at as soon, like, I found your podcast, and then like a week or two after I found your podcast, that announcement came, and I was like, gosh, Steve sure picked a time to focus in on the papacy.
Yeah.
That was quite early in your show, as I recall.
I think it was about a month after I had launched it. So I had been working on it for maybe 6 months to a year before, launched in January. And then it was a few weeks later, and I felt like I just had to discuss this. I mean, that was history happening at this point. And I really had no idea really about any of that, like the modern. So I opened up the constitutions and read through the rules. And I think it was, if anything, that really helped frame the rest of the podcast, because it really made me think more in that mode of how are they elected? That's a really pivotal moment of any papacy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It almost reminds me of, and I may be, putting you up on a higher scale, but that's okay. We're podcasters. We're not necessarily, if you want it to be interesting, you can't be the absolute most humble person, although it does help. But there's the story of, I think it was a CIA director who got his, job on like September 6th or something, 2001. So like all of a sudden, here's this on your desk, and that this is all you're going to be dealing with for a while. Kind of reminded me of that. And like with the actual election of Pope Francis, he indicated, and, we'll get back to this, but, he indicated he had kind of been under consideration before, but he basically said, like, don't have me be a way of blocking someone else, that someone else being Pope Benedict. And so obviously, Pope Benedict kind of had his time and decided he had enough, for, what he listed as health reasons. And he really was looking not good, sort of in the short term there. Thankfully he carried on for almost, I think, a decade after. But with Pope Francis's election, suddenly you have this Pope who's already, just by nature of existing, breaking hundreds and, over 1,000 years of tradition, not only by being a pope who takes a new regnal name that hadn't happened in, hundreds of years and centuries. And the Vatican does think in centuries, famously, but it's still kind of surprising when it has a new thought after a while. And in Pope Francis's case, you kind of sensed this newness right off the bat, and the media definitely picked up on that. And, in some cases, I think they sort of ran with it beyond the actual reality. But there was definitely sort of, you might call it like a media moment. Like Pope Benedict, unfortunately, the thing that he was really lacking was sort of that the media didn't like him. Whereas with Pope Francis, you could tell that really had turned around, for whatever reason. And, whether it's because it's this non-European cardinal being elected, even though, like I said, he does have that Italian descent, but, it had been the 7th century, I think. Like Gregory the Third maybe was the last non-European pope, something like that. And I mean, that's quite a streak to break.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, Steve here. If you're enjoying the History of the Papacy podcast, consider joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy. We're working toward going completely listener funded, which means no more ads ever. When you join, you get early access to episodes, monthly book giveaways, and most importantly, your name is added to the History of the Papacy Diptychs, our own list of commemorated supporters. You can become an Antioch level supporter for just $3 per month, but it makes a huge difference to making the History of the Papacy ad-free and independent. Nobody likes ads, not you, not me, and I'm the guy who records them. So let's just get rid of them. Visit patreon.com/history of the papacy and join today. I get the feeling too that after that such a long reign of John Paul II, and he was so transformative that they were really trying to elect a placeholder who probably would be kind of mild and not change very much, and maybe not hang around that long either before they could reconfigure. But I think that they got that transformational pope in Francis. And he was relatively young, relatively by papal standards. How old was he approximately?
Let me see. So he wasn't like John Paul II young, right? They knew they were, electing a 50-something-year-old. But he was, he was born in 36. So, you can condense me doing the math here. He would have been about 67. So, not in his 70s like a whole lot of cardinals. So he would have been 67 at the time.
So, I mean, if you look at any world leader that's not outside of the range of normalcy for a world leader.
Yeah, although I did just do the math wrong. So actually 77. Never mind.
Oh, so that is getting a little north of normal.
Pope Benedict, but yeah, he was. Yeah, I mean, he was about the expected age. He was younger than Pope Benedict, but at the same time, they kind of, what with life expectancies kind of going as they have, just generally, the fact that they make cardinals stop participating in the conclaves once they turn 80 at this point. It almost kind of assures that, unless you pick someone who's really looking green around the gills, or just hasn't aged well, there's a strong chance that you're going to have a longer papacy as long as that rule is in play. So.
Do you think that, before we get too much into Francis, that you're going to get more popes resigning just because with life expectancies? I think that we're seeing this more and more where leaders hang on too long. Just the natural state of things as you get into the end stages in your 80s and your 90s, you're not as fresh and maybe not at your best to do the heavy lifting that's required of that sort of job.
Yeah, I don't know. And that's kind of hard for me to say because I make it my business to know Pope stuff. And I know you do as well, so you're asking the question. So, it is something where it's kind of hard to tell, and it's going to depend very much on the individual, because this is a case where, famously, it's really hard to tell the Pope what to do. And when people are trying to tell the Pope what to do, that's when you get some really dramatic moments in papal history. And sometimes, what they're trying to tell the Pope to do is to not resign. I think of Celestine V, who, got elected Pope, and they're like, okay, you're Pope now. And he's like, okay, I'm Pope now, but I don't want to be. Like, yeah, no, but you're Pope now. He said, okay, well, as Pope, I can do, the Pope thing, right? And just, I'm the boss. Yes, you're the boss. Okay, well, I decree that the Pope can quit, and also I quit. Like, that's kind of how that worked out. As far as Pope Francis goes, I don't think he will resign. I actually thought he would. Kind of at this point, I would say maybe notoriously, there's an episode where I did a bit of a conversation with Pontifex, speculating that, maybe, with bishops required to submit their resignation at 75, canonically, and cardinals sort of losing their voting rights automatically at the age of 80. I was like, well, Pope Benedict stepped down right around when he was 85. Maybe Pope Francis will do the same. Obviously, he didn't. He's 88 now. But, I was definitely thinking I was willing to call it likely, right? I was willing to place one of my non-impactful, and I'm very often wrong about these sort of things, like, wagers on it. But it didn't happen. And at this point, having gone through the recent health crisis he had, I would say he is planning to go to the grave as Pope, barring something where he's just completely medically incapacitated, right? I think he already has mentioned that he's got sort of his resignation paperwork on file to be enacted, if he goes comatose or something. But he, almost the first thing he did while out of the hospital, or it might have even been before he was formally discharged, he took some of the fruits of what he's been putting in terms of church, tweaking with this synod on synodality that's kind of been, rolling along through the years. And he said, okay, well, here's what the next, 3, 4, 5 years of that are going to look like. And so that's not, the governance of someone who's preparing to hand off the reins. And that's, with the knowledge of the medical crisis that he had. So, I think if he was going to resign, it would have been from this. But he also, he used to say, when people were pointing out, like, oh, you're in a wheelchair more, you're looking more frail, on the getting around front, how does that, impact? You're not going to be able to John Paul II it up, with these papal travels. And he said, you don't govern the church with your legs. And, to an extent, I think there is something to be said for papal travel. And I don't think, he's going to see, the long talked about trip was, him potentially going back to Argentina at some point. I don't think that's going to happen. But I do think he's made peace with, I can govern without my legs. And, he's already been governing with missing half a lung for his entire papacy. So apparently that's not going to stop him either.
Let's rewind back all the way to the beginning. Where does Pope Francis, pre-Pope Francis, Jose Maria Bergoglio, where does he come from? You touched a little bit that he's of Italian ancestry, which is pretty common in Argentina. I think it's about 75% of the people have full Italian ancestry. It might even be higher than that, but it could be lower. Don't quote me 100%, but it's, I don't know. That's some astronomical number.
Yeah. I mean, I know it's very common. And part of it, I think maybe has to do with the fact that, historically Spain and Italy had a lot of connections because like the Mediterranean is more of a highway than a barrier. And there was, common, not just common Catholicism, obviously, but a lot of trade connections and that sort of thing. As far as, the exact nature of that phenomenon, I'm not sure. Like, why is, so much of the ancestry of a lot of the U.S. German? Like, there are historical reasons for this, but we don't necessarily need to dwell too far into that. But yes, it was not too surprising, that his father, who literally, came across on, the stereotypical boat, kind of fleeing Mussolini's regime with his parents, ended up meeting, a nice Italian girl, even though they were in the New World. So it was not too surprising. He grew up sort of middle class. I believe he was the oldest of 5 children. And, one of the earliest anecdotes that, he mentions, because it is nice to sort of draw, straight from the source, because, you think he would know. And he did very helpfully put out what's billed as an autobiography. But really, I do think the people that pointed out, this is more like just another one of his sort of book length interviews that has been sort of reformatted, right? You could tell it's just sort of like, him conversationally talking with someone, which also that does match his style. And I do think, if he sat down and, fully wrote as opposed to ghost wrote an autobiography, that's what form you'd expect it to take. So it is convincing, but also, I I don't think, he necessarily saw it as his autobiography, like, hey, I'm writing a book now. Here, I'm telling my life story to this guy over a number of sessions. And it is several hundred pages. It's called Hope. If you want to look it up. My kids were always amused when I was reading it because, like, oh, you're reading Hope by the Pope? So, they liked the rhyme. And I was kind of impressed with my oldest, who's, 11 now. And he was actually, he read the first couple chapters and he was like, whoa, because, it talks about how on his mother's side it might have been, or it might actually be, his father, basically, the boat that they were supposed to get on, they didn't quite have everything ready in time. They're sort of scrambling, trying to sell things, to get all their assets liquid to transfer over to the New World. They weren't like, absolutely hard scrabble. But, they were just delayed by this process. And so they missed their intended boat. And then their intended boat ended up, sinking along the way. And so, there's this story about, like, the folk songs, talk about, like, like people, one of those very cheery folk songs where, everyone's dying in the water and getting eaten by sharks. So not as many sharks in U.S. folk songs, but I guess that has to do with being, in warmer waters, as it were. But, I mean, just this immigrant nature of the journey is clearly something that Pope Francis wanted to draw attention to, right, as his opening. And so, it was kind of cool as just a parenting moment to sort of see my son, like, reading this very much adult level book. It's not like reading through a papal encyclical. It's more conversational than that. So you don't get bogged down with the terminology, but it is, full on reading and, just seeing him get to that point I was waiting for, because I was like, all right, he's going to get to sharks in like 5 pages. So I'll see how long this takes. But yes, so he managed to dodge the sharks. And then, he basically credits his life to being saved by nuns at multiple points. One of the first ones was because, his mother, wasn't able to produce milk. And so basically some nuns that sort of helped people out in the neighborhood came by and, just like, oh, well, this isn't going to work. And so they went and got donkey's milk to kind of hook him up and help him grow. And it was, apparently kind of an eclectic neighborhood. He talks about, growing up with, Jews, Muslims, atheists, obviously thinking eclectic in the religious sense, because when you're talking the Pope, you're mainly focusing on that angle. But there was, kind of a more secular connection in that apparently one of his neighbor girls, he would, just kind of like, tell her like, you were nobody, like, I'm going to marry you. And they're like 5 years old, right? And literally this neighbor girl's mother is chasing away Jorge Bergoglio, the future Pope, with literally a broom. So I'm sorry, that just kind of cracked me up when I saw that included in there. And like he was like, I had forgotten about this, but apparently the lady kept this drawing that he had made as a young man of like, here's the house we're going to live in. I got you like a little white house. I drew it on this piece of paper. And I guess, mother did not entirely correct her thoughts towards him, because she kept that paper for years and showed it to him when he was Pope. So there's an image for you. Apparently, this is not too surprising, right? But he was, a lover of things that you would expect a young, Latin American, yes, still Latin American. We're still in the Americas. Forget my terminology. But yes, a young Argentinian boy to enjoy, right? He liked soccer, definitely, enjoyed kind of playing that on the street. He enjoyed tango music, being an Argentinian growing up in, 30s, 40s. That certainly checks out. And then, just some of his more interesting sort of boyhood interests included things like basketball and pizza, although at one point he talks casually about his stuffed octopus recipe, so maybe it's not sort of the pizza that we're as super familiar with. But he also apparently enjoyed stamp collecting, so I'm sure he's at least paid attention to his surroundings as he does these papal travels, because he talks about how he used to travel through rectangles, right, just with those little stamps, and that was certainly a hobby of the time. And that's been around for generations. Yeah. He ended up getting, I mean, he was raised Catholic, right? So he sort of naturally had a bit of religious background. This isn't too surprising. But around when he was in 6th grade, he actually ended up in a boarding school because his mother, her youngest child had been kind of a difficult pregnancy. And so he ended up in a school run by the Salesians, which is an order that's kind of devoted to helping like poor and migrant children and their families, and they're especially focused on education. So, you can sort of see, again, like, social justice and the poor being the things that I kind of, anticipated from him, just kind of knowing just, strict bullet points of his background. You could sort of see maybe some of the influences there early on, just kind of being in that setting with the Salesians. But then he sort of goes off in a different direction than we might expect, because he actually ended up at a technical school and wound up, with a chemical technician's certificate. He was, kind of doing sort of food research and testing to see, like, how many calories are in X. And apparently at one point, he was testing chocolate and certainly got a bit distracted with the product. So I'm thinking like a Willy Wonka type situation. And then he did kind of go and see the world a bit career-wise, while staying in Argentina. But, he worked as a bouncer. He worked as a janitor. A few things that might be surprising, but he was, fairly physically fit. And so, I guess you could see a bit of the bouncer aspect, although it's not usually something you'd expect from a pope. He did have some trauma as they were sort of wrapping up that school with the food chemistry, because one of his colleagues, who was still like a teenager out of himself, actually ended up killing his neighbor. So sorry, you might put a little warning on there, but that kind of came out of the blue. But I guess, it came out of the blue for him too, right? And his colleagues too. And so, it was just a situation where it's just like, clearly like a mental illness sort of thing. And, the young man, like, he obviously, got to go to, off to be reformed and such. But it was a hard period for that whole class, as you can imagine. And the young man, apparently Pope Francis ended up defending him from teasing, or at least this is, Pope Francis's account. And yeah, I mean, it's not a story that had a happy ending, but, there is definitely some weighty stuff in Pope Francis's life, just like there is, with anybody's life. Although later on, as we'll see, he does get to sort of having weighty things happen at a higher level, which we'll get to here in a bit. He did eventually, and this is not, a huge shocking twist, he did eventually feel himself called to the priesthood. And this was just kind of the product of, just being just a practicing Catholic. He'd go to confession periodically, and it wasn't something he put a lot of stock in. Like he wasn't really considering the priesthood in any serious way before this, but, he just had this experience in confession, and just, sort of felt the forgiveness and sort of just saw, like, what a good priest does in the world from this experience. And it just so happened that, the priest was someone who was out of town, or from out of town, which is always a great sort of situation to go and have your confession with the priest you're not going to see again. But in the end, he did actually sort of look up that priest, a few times in the coming weeks. And it, eventually turned out that priest was, there for kind of medical reasons, from what I recall. And the priest ended up dying, but he was sort of the one that sort of inspired Pope Francis into this vocation. Specifically, Pope Francis ties it in with the call of Matthew, the tax collector. And just, it's odd because he specifically calls out the Venerable Bede's translation, which you wouldn't really expect to have that sort of English translation, because that's like his like fourth or fifth language. It's not, something he's very comfortable with. But, sometimes you're kind of learning something in school and maybe it just sort of sticks out to you. So, something about like mercying and choosing is how Bede described Jesus looking on at Matthew, the tax collector, and Jorge Bergoglio, the future Pope Francis, kind of saw himself, being mercied, being chosen from that combination. And so, he started thinking about it. He said, he didn't immediately act on it because, it's you're not necessarily going to turn on a dime. But part of it seems like the hesitation was it was not necessarily something his parents, or, well, in particular, his mother was actually very excited about. Like I said, they were Catholic, but it was, a family that had, expectations that were not necessarily going to be met by their oldest son going off and becoming a priest. So she was actually not particularly supportive. He said, like she didn't insist that I not do it. She just did not show any sign of, joy or enthusiasm. And she would not accompany him, like, when he was getting dropped off to the seminary. It was just one of those sort of like quiet protest things, which can be harsh coming from a mother.
Argentina is really interesting, and he came up in Argentina during a time where it transitioned, I believe, in the early 1900s up until about World War I. Argentina, as far as GDP, wasn't that far behind the United States. It was a top 10 economy in the world. And through a variety of things that are outside of the scope of this podcast, they really took a big crash, and they never, even to this day, have really recovered from that. And it's kind of put them into the developing world status. But I think that where a young Jorge Bergoglio was at, it's in a country that's pretty wealthy. It's, as far as world terms goes. But as any place, it has its neighborhoods that are, it sounds like he had, would you say overall, like a pretty middle class upbringing, not super poor, but not super wealthy, something.
Yeah.
Somewhat what we might consider, or what our grandparents would, or great grandparents would consider normal.
Yeah. Yeah. And you sort of get the sense, like this connection with his mother, that, maybe it's that sort of almost, well, I guess it is stereotypical, sort of immigrant approach of like, we came over here and we worked hard, through the generations to build up this family. And, it was your turn to be a doctor. And so you're going to go off and not take us to the upper class. Like, come on, man.
Or especially as the oldest, too.
Right.
Like maybe that was somebody a little further down the chain could do that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. When he was looking more at the priesthood, he did start looking at the Jesuits, which, it's not hard to find Jesuits in Latin America, in Argentina and elsewhere. It was at one point, they were actually banned for a little while. But the thing that makes it interesting to have a future Pope be a Jesuit is, while there is a special connection to the papacy, like, they've got this, sort of famous, like, fourth vow where they basically go wherever the Pope tells them to on missions around the world. And that's how you have so many Jesuit missionaries making such an impact in the, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. But despite that connection to the papacy, you're not typically going to expect a Jesuit to be a Pope. Pope Francis certainly was the first time that's ever happened, in part because Jesuits basically, one of their rules is they're not supposed to accept any promotions unless they're kind of forced to it by obedience. So, you basically sort of automatically have to decline is the way it's supposed to work when you're a Jesuit, which, kind of makes sense with when we were talking about that, first conclave where, he was the leading candidate and he kind of declined then. So maybe that kind of, eased the way with him internally to accept later on. But a Jesuit background is an interesting one for a future Pope to have. although Jesuits were not his only possibility, because he also apparently looked at the Dominicans, which are a teaching order, and he does certainly seem to have enjoyed learning. He talks about how he was not the first in his class, but he wasn't, far. He was, top, 3 or 4, that kind of thing. Like, I could certainly picture his teacher sort of say like, well, maybe if you applied yourself more and stopped, chasing after the neighbor girls and playing all the soccer stuff. But, he's like, well, that's what I'm going to do. Like, I'm a kid. So he wasn't, he read a lot, but he wasn't the bookworm type. And you sort of get like a social sense from him, right? Like the way he did not move into the papal apartments, for example, and decided to continue living communally. And that's something they talked about as well, because the Jesuits were and are an order that does tend to live communally, like most religious orders. So interesting there as well. I do want to touch on some of the health stuff with Pope Francis while he was in the seminary, because apparently, he kind of ended up getting H2N2, like the Asian flu. I don't know if that's the appropriate term, but that's the term that he used in his autobiography. So I was like, well, I'll roll with that. That way I don't call it the wrong thing, at least as far as he's concerned. And it was, to a tricky enough point where, not to flash back to a couple months ago, but, it was a matter of, if he wasn't going to get the right cocktail of medicine from the doctors, that could be the end for him as, a 20-something. And that was the second time he sort of credits a nun as saving his life, because basically, she was there as a nurse. And as soon as the doctor left the room, she was like, okay, well, you technicians go ahead and double that dosage. And he's like, yeah, he's pretty convinced you could tell that that did make the difference for him, because, yeah, that was rough times. And actually, a bit of a relapse or, follow-up complications from that is when he ended up losing half of one of his lungs, which obviously was a pretty major operation even today. But in the 1950s, that was that was something else. And he described it as extraordinarily painful, in case you're wondering, which I don't think is too surprising.
Yeah, that seems to track. It's interesting. The Jesuits are an interesting order in that, like you said, they were banned for a time. And a little fun side fact is that the Jesuits really, the institutions of the Jesuits, even though they were officially banned in most Catholic in all Catholic countries, the United States and Russia, two very not Catholic countries, is where they were able to exist and then eventually mount their comeback from.
Yes, that is one of my favorite acts. You've got Catherine the Great here, Tsar of all Russias, just kind of enabling the Jesuits to hang on, as it were, through a couple generations. And I do want to say it is funny to me because you have folks, and even before Pope Francis, the Jesuits sort of had this reputation of like Jesuit tricks, right? Like they're going to sort of be the manipulators behind the scenes. This was honestly the historical reputation that got them banned in the first place. But you see a place, the Jesuits, as soon as they go off the scene, you see they were banned in, I think, 1773 or something like that. Within 10 years, you've got the American Revolution. And, another, decade and a bit after that, you've got the French Revolution. And these are both things that happen to fall within that 40-year window where, the Jesuits were officially suppressed. So, you see people talking about like, oh, these Jesuit tricks, they're the ones that kind of, maybe like, oh, they did Vatican II, or, like they're the ones kind of like, manipulating the church. Well, we tried getting rid of the Jesuits for a bit, and you saw what happened. So, sorry. I don't think it's actually that simple, but it did kind of make me chuckle when I put the years together there, and like, oh, what happened when the Jesuits weren't on the scene?
What sort of happens in Jorge Bergoglio's early priesthood?
Yeah. So he was, apart from the near death, and I guess I should say, Jesuit formation is a really long process. So, he had, that lung surgery in like the mid 50s or so. He officially joined the Jesuits sort of at the introductory level in 58. But then, 2 years later, he did his initial vows, and that's when, he was sort of fully fledged, but it wasn't his final vows yet. He had to go get sort of like a master's in philosophy, which is pretty standard for a priest. Usually they've got like masters in philosophy, maybe one theology. But honestly, it wasn't until 1969, actually, that he was ordained a priest at the age of 33. So Jesuit formation is long, and believe it or not, it actually continues after ordination. So it wasn't actually until 1973 that he officially took his final vows, including that, fourth vow of going wherever the Pope would send him. And he was, apparently willing. 73, one of his plans was going on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, but apparently that was cut short by the Yom Kippur War. But apart from that, he didn't really have much time to be a young priest out of the spotlight, as it were, because in that same year that he was ordained, 1973, which is kind of crazy to think about this being in the same year as you're ordained. And he also called it madness. Like, he himself was like, yeah, this was absolutely crazy. He was actually made to be the superior, the provincial superior. So in charge of all of the Jesuits in Argentina, which was kind of shocking. But he also said, there wasn't really another, easy way to go, because things were kind of getting chaotic. The next year was when, sort of like the official start of what's called Argentina's Dirty War. So you want to talk about hard times in Argentina. Well, from 1974 to 1983, there was, just sort of a, I guess I would call it, no? Yeah, I think Dirty War is a pretty good evocative phrase. So maybe we'll just kind of keep that, right? It wasn't an official, campaign, but, hundreds and thousands of people would kind of disappear. Those who criticized sort of the Argentina's government at the time, sort of the phrase right-wing death squads pops up, but it wasn't always a matter of, strict politics. And even now, it's not always clear what was happening in all of these cases. And this is where, I mentioned Jorge Bergoglio kind of ending up acting in, some really dark situations as an adult. Here he is, the head of the Jesuit order, for example. And in 1976, 2 Jesuit priests were abducted and were held captive for months. Now, thankfully they ended up surviving their particular ordeal. But one of them was pretty convinced, he didn't explicitly say it. But one of them was pretty convinced that, Jorge Bergoglio could have stopped this, right? He could have, put a word out and, they would have said, oops, our bad. Now, Pope Francis on his side, says that he did, kind of do everything he could, right down to having dinner with the guy that was sort of running the show and, had given, as near as anyone could tell, the order. This was all shadow stuff, right? So it's hard to tell, exactly what was going on, but there was sort of like a naval unit that everyone kind of knew had done this and, was sort of confirmed by the people who had been, held prisoner, captive. In the end, with this particular situation, which is kind of like the most hairy of the ones, in terms of Pope Francis's personal involvement, Father Iorio, he passed away in 2000. So, we don't know what he would have said if he had been around for Pope Francis being elected, but he certainly, was not a Pope Francis fan and, never directly accused him of kind of betraying them. But you could tell from his writings and, the way he spoke about it, that was his sense, right? He kind of skirted right up to the edge of saying that because, that would have been something pretty big to say. And I would say if I had gotten, kind of abducted for criticizing, powerful figures in my past, and, it very well could have been the end. I might be hesitant to do it again. It seems Argentina's, certainly improved from that situation, but it's also worth noting that Father, I think it's Yalix, the other priest involved, is, or at least was, still alive. I think he's still around. But he was still alive when Pope Francis was elected. And so, obviously that was a pretty natural focal point for, here's a story from when Pope Francis wasn't Pope yet. Here's some of his backstory. Let's talk about this with, sort of the media interest. And, he for his part, he insisted that, I guess he did pass away. I do have in my notes that he died insisting that their betrayal, his and Father Iorio's, wasn't at the hands of Cardinal Bergoglio, or, Provincial Superior Father Bergoglio. And he considered the matter closed with, no hard feelings at that point. So, we've got one that's didn't live long enough to really give his testimony at that deeper level. And one who said, there's not anything there at this point anymore. Right. So it was tough times. But at the same time, it's worth noting that, there were bishops who were disappeared, who, were martyred. Ultimately, I think it's fair to say. And certainly I would say, the future Pope Francis, this is, we're trying to not really get into his papacy, but he did end up canonizing, or at least beatifying, one of these bishops, Bishop Angelelli, as a martyr, which is an interesting spot to see yourself in, because he would have, basically, he wasn't a bishop yet at this point, but basically he was a colleague, right? Because here he is running the Jesuits, Pope Francis, and here Bishop Angelelli is criticizing the government, perhaps more forcefully and condemning, these disappearances, and he winds up being assassinated.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors.
Yeah,
I think it's fascinating in that this is really the genesis where you can, anybody who has any opinion on Pope Francis can dive into this, and you can dive into any number of conspiracy rabbit holes. But if you look at it, he was pretty green as in his leadership role in the Jesuits, and anybody who's that young and that new to his position, and how hard of a line are you going to really take? I mean, to give him maximum generosity, he would have been in an incredibly tough position with a military junta that's disappearing people right, left, and center. He's got to work with them to some degree, but he has to stand up against them. And he's pretty much just been ordained not too long earlier. He's in a pretty major leadership role, but doesn't have a lot of weight behind him. In my job, we'd say he didn't have very big shoulders to go up against this.
Yeah, I mean, this is before he's 40, right? I mean, I'm talking about him sort of being, a little bit of a colleague to these bishops, but also he's not, because he's younger than they are, right? And it's that green aspect, like you mentioned. So yeah, one of the people that he was actually, connected to that ended up, so he got a call at one point, not unusual, for someone in his position as a priest to get a call from someone asking to give last rites. But, apparently he was kind of surprised because he knew fairly well the person who was asking to give last rites, and it was definitely not a Catholic. They said it was last rites for a family member, so, that's not too surprising. But he kind of had a sense that something was up, because it was his old boss, who was actually a Marxist woman from his, food chemistry days. Miss Balestrino, I believe is how that's pronounced. And apparently, his suspicions that, maybe something was up were correct, because when he showed up, he learned that the actual reason for him being called was because she thought maybe he could help her smuggle out some incriminating communist literature she had in her household. She'd taken notes on this stuff. It was really going to be a caught red-handed sort of thing as terms of the junta's perspective. And, he, says he, complied and helped out with that, because, it was one of those situations where either, you help them hide in this case documents, or, it's going to be presumably the end for them. In this case, it still, apparently wasn't enough, because she still, ended up, and I mean, she was still publicly, decrying the disappearances and, seeking justice for other people who had disappeared. Like, hey, where are these people? What's happened to them, in the newspaper. So it's not like, this library that would certainly make, whatever sort of process there might have been easier. It certainly wasn't the only evidence that it could be used against her, and was ultimately used against her, because she did end up disappeared. Her body was found a few months later, as I understand it. And so that was, kind of somebody I had a personal connection with in this scenario. So after, I guess in the later stages of the Dirty War, after he was done with his kind of sort of a 6-year term for being a provincial superior like that, he actually did go over to Ireland to study English, which, his English is not as good as yours or mine, but his English is definitely better than my Italian or my Spanish, right? So one of those situations. And in this sort of like, post, having this huge role as a 30-something, second tour of his educational opportunities, he started to look at potentially getting his doctorate in Germany, but that didn't actually end up panning out. So that higher, I guess probably highest level of education is not something that he went for. Like I said, he was good on the books, but it was not, really his passion. He did end up as a rector at a seminary that he had taught at, which I have found is something that's very common for these bios for cardinals. I didn't realize that there were so dang many seminaries until I started looking into these. It seems everyone ends up as the rector of the seminary where they studied, at least for like a few years, kind of paying your dues, give them back, that sort of thing. At this period, he was kind of cooling a little bit in his relations with the Jesuit community in general. It seemed like maybe he was a little bit more willing to push some envelopes than those around him, which honestly I would say is still true today. But one interesting thing in this, what he calls a sort of a more difficult period for him, because he did like that sort of communal aspect and he was sort of being a little bit outcast. But this was sort of a time when he gave up watching television, because basically like he was like, I was watching like this show and I was like, you know what, this is just useless. I'm not really getting anything out of this. He sort of had this sense, being a good Catholic boy, he describes it as some sort of a message he was getting from Our Lady. And so he said, there's nothing in this for you, right? It's not helping you along. And so, to this day, he rarely watches TV. He did apparently make exceptions for things like there was a plane crash in Buenos Aires in 99 and 9/11. Apparently he did. Sounds really callous to put it this way, but he did kind of tune in for that, right? So yeah, a little bit of Pope Francis trivia there. It wasn't too long after this period, though, that he did kind of get a second wind, church-wise, because this is when he was picked by Pope John Paul II, Pope St. John Paul II, to be the auxiliary bishop. This was the time in 92 is when Pope St. John Paul II kind of picked him, and this is usually in Pope Francis's case it's unusual because he had this leader of the Jesuits in Argentina, this provincial superior role, very early on in his career. Usually it's when they get picked as a bishop that you can kind of see like, okay, yeah, now they're really kind of rising up through the ranks. In Pope Francis's case, he'd kind of already had that initial splash, but he was, in any event, nominated as the auxiliary bishop. It was basically like assistant bishop, right, of Buenos Aires, because there's 5 million Catholics in there, something like that. You kind of need more than one to effectively administer it. And obviously, they use priests as well, and deacons and everyone else. But it's not unusual to have multiple bishops in a diocese like that. So he, went about doing his thing. But it wasn't too long after that he was, the priest who consecrated him, right, or the bishop who consecrated him as a priest, was the one that he was serving as the Bishop of Buenos Aires. So there was already that connection. Presumably he had put in a good word to John Paul II to make this sort of happen, right? But ultimately he kind of got picked as his successor, and by kind of I mean very formally, because he became the coadjutor archbishop. I don't know. Have you come across coadjutor bishops before? I know they're not much of a thing in the earliest church. If memory serves me, they're sort of like a higher level than just a co-bishop. And don't they break them down where they will have a specific territory inside of the archdiocese? It's not unusual for them to do that. I don't know if they always do that for every archdiocese. But what's unique about the coadjutor archbishop is you're only going to have one, because they're the ones that kind of automatically have succession rights. So, if the principal bishop, right, the archbishop in this case, if and when he passes away, or more often in modern times, kind of as we discussed earlier, resigns. It used to be, something the bishops, they would always hang on until death, and resignations were extremely unusual. But resignations are the norm now, at least for bishops. And I do think we will see them more for popes in the future, but I just don't see it with Pope Francis at this point. Like I said, I've thought differently before. But is that a pretty universal practice then? And the coadjutor is the next in line? Not universal. It's not like there's always a coadjutor bishop waiting in the wings. I would say 1 out of every 10 times you'll have one. Usually what happens is you get a coadjutor bishop when, observers can tell, you're less than a year away. You're not usually coadjutor bishop for years and years. There are cases, and there are also cases, because this is the Catholic Church. Everything kind of happens, right? It's a huge institution with, honestly, a surprising amount of different things going on in the different areas, right? The dioceses have a lot of discretion. Do they divide up these auxiliaries with different geographical areas? Yes, certainly. I know in Rome they do that. I don't know if they always do that in other cases. Like, sometimes you sort of got like the church, department of the poor, the department of deacons, like you're sort of handling different responsibilities in different ways. But bottom line, coadjutor is something that's, it's not unheard of, but it's not the standard, right? But once you're coadjutor, it is the standard that you will be expected to replace someone. That mandatory retirement age of 75, for example, is typically where we're at with that, right? It's someone who's getting ready to hand over the reins. One of the later signs is that they actually have that formal successor in place. And so it was not really surprising to anyone the following year when Archbishop Quaracino, I believe, is how you say that, went ahead and passed on the reins to Pope Francis. In this case, I do think it was actually his death. So he must have been fairly sickly. So one interesting thing is that he did not just become the bishop for the Latin Catholics in Argentina, because as you know, like the Catholic Church isn't just Roman Catholics, right? There's these 24 different, they call them sui juris, self-governing churches that make up the overall universal Catholic Church. 98% of them, the vast majority, are these Latin or aka Roman Catholics. But there's also the various Eastern Catholics. And Argentina, along with the U.S., is one of actually a fairly small number of countries. There's like 5 or 6 in the world where they have these, they're called ordinariates for the people of Eastern rites that don't have their own bishop. And so in the case of Argentina, it is fairly common for the Archbishop of Buenos Aires to actually be the spiritual father of not just the Roman Catholics, but the Eastern Catholics as well. The Greek Orthodox, the Ukrainian, Ukrainian Greek. There's a lot of, stacking on of different terms to make up these 24 churches. But apparently Pope Francis did not just kind of phone in that role, right? He did not just take that as an additional title and just, not really think much about it. Major Archbishop Sviatoslav Shevchuk, who I've talked about before and we'll probably talk about again, he's the head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholics. And he was specifically complimentary of the job that Pope Francis had done, kind of with these people that were not of his, Latin rite. Now, granted, that was also, comments made when he had just been elected Pope. And I think it is fairly normal that when you're an influential archbishop and, you're talking about the new Pope, you probably are going to be enthusiastic. But he didn't necessarily have to specifically compliment him on that. So
I've seen some about Sviatoslav Shevchuk. Do you think that somebody like him could be a pope, that somebody from one of the sui juris ordinates could become pope one day? Or is that that's a bridge too far?
So one day is, you can have a lot of days in one day. I do not think that that's something that we'll see in our lifetimes. But as I have kind of demonstrated, I am not great on predictions, despite my fondness for making them. So, I would certainly be open to being wrong about that. In Sviatoslav's case, I do not think that that is something that's in the cards for him, because he actually is in, I'm going to go ahead and call it a politically sensitive position, right, with Ukraine and Russia and all of that stuff. Basically, all of his predecessors had been made a cardinal. And Sviatoslav was one of the last appointments of Pope Benedict. And, there was sort of an expectation that, he would be made a cardinal just like his predecessors had been. But it's been a while since Pope Benedict, and he's still not a cardinal. And he's still around. He's still actually fairly young, young enough that actually, if it weren't for the precedent of his predecessors kind of being made cardinal, he's sort of at the next opportunity. It wouldn't be that surprising if he didn't get the nod yet, because I think he's still in his 50s. He might be in his 60s now, but he is still pretty young. But bottom line, I called him a major archbishop, and that's a technical term that came basically from a reluctance to actually formally establish the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church as a sui juris church headed by a full-on patriarch. I know, you've talked about patriarchs in your shows before. You'll talk about patriarchs again. But basically, the major archbishop in canon law is someone who's at the patriarch level, but just not quite there, because that's going to make a real splash with the any other patriarchs who happen to be sitting around both inside and outside. Even if they're not in communion with the Catholic Church at this point, it's kind of keeping an eye on that thinking in centuries. Like, is this something that's going to prevent being able to work with the Russian Orthodox? The answer, at least from the Russian government and at this point for the Russian Orthodox, is very much yes. So I don't anticipate a Ukrainian in that role, but it would certainly be fascinating, and it would certainly be a statement. Now, there are a couple of sui juris churches in India that, if I had to pick a tradition for this to potentially come out of, for something were to happen. There's the Syro-Malabar and the Syro-Malankar. Obviously, there's some similarities there in terms of their traditions, but I think the Syro-Malabar is the larger one. So if I had to take a guess, it would be someone like, he's too old at this point to expect it. But Cardinal, I believe it's Cardinal Alancherry is from that tradition. So someone like that, I could, if you told me it happened and you had me guess who, I would say someone, potentially from one of the Indian churches. Yeah.
Interesting.
Thought experiment.
Very interesting. It's interesting too, because Pope Francis, not to get too much into his papacy, but he seemed to be a lot more accommodating to these other traditions, where I've done episodes on where these different traditions, they have certain very well-defined canonical rights, and the local Latin bishop will completely ignore those rights. That was a proud tradition of
just completely ignoring what, yes.
But it's pretty clear that Bergoglio as a bishop and then into his papacy has been a lot more loose, which I think that some Catholics in some quarters don't like, that are not as comfortable with that leniency as others are, which I think that that's one of the Pope Francis and clearly Cardinal or clearly Bishop Bergoglio is a very multifaceted individual.
And it's interesting because, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but, we talk about these like disparate groups, right? And Pope Francis, he's clearly a big tent sort of guy. He does have a side where he will be very happy to, condemn, things that he doesn't like, right? He's not always lovey-dovey, right? He has certainly a stern mode that he can get into, but in general, he is, focused, on, kind of a big tent thing. But one of the things that's surprising is he somehow, and I don't quite understand it, but I'm kind of impressed by it. He seems to have maintained good relations with the, particularly traditionalist folks over in the SSPX. I don't know if you've looked at them, but, the people that are very much pro, the Tridentine Mass, the old Latin Mass. And, here he is, effectively suppressing it, going well, all right, I won't get into it, but, he still somehow manages to kind of keep them relatively on side, right? They're not like waving, pro-Francis placards, but they're not the ones that he's finding himself excommunicating, right? And he has done some excommunication, which is another thing that I thought that maybe we had seen the last of. But when you get bishops calling you the Antichrist, you can't just necessarily sit there, or I guess you could.
Yeah.
But, yeah, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. So Pope Francis isn't even a cardinal yet in this. He will be soon, though. It's not a surprise that the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, like I mentioned, there are these roles where customarily, once you have them, you can pretty much count on getting the cardinal's red hat, right? Getting that elevation. In the case of Pope Francis, he was technically elevated sort of at the next opportunity, right? He was in the next batch of new cardinals, but this was a case where, it was Pope St. John Paul II was in his last days, right? Well, I guess in his last years, because it was 3 years between his elevation as the Archbishop and him actually becoming a cardinal in 2005 in JP2's last consistory. I think it was 2005. As Archbishop, he also was the Grand Chancellor of the Pontifical Academy of Argentina, because, becoming Grand Chancellor, not just Chancellor, mind you, Grand Chancellor, is the sort of thing that you just kind of automatically get when you're at that sort of Archbishop level in a very large diocese like that. And that was one where I didn't really see anything going on with that. It's just, I always like to kind of see the accumulation of titles, right? It's part of just the decoration of Catholicism. So like I said, he took the being the ordinary of the Eastern Catholics fairly seriously, but it didn't seem like the Pontifical Academy of Argentina was something that he was that worried about. He did, however, worry about some of the things that we have kind of, seen as familiar for him. For example, apparently one of his initiatives as Archbishop was to double the number of priests kind of serving in the slums of Buenos Aires. And for that, he got the nickname of the Slum Bishop. So that's an interesting one. And he actually said at one point that the communists had sort of stolen the flag of the poor from the Christians. Here Christians are supposed to be taking care of the poor, and, they're kind of being shown up by Marxists and communists. And that wasn't like I said, one of his close personal friends was a Marxist. So I certainly don't think it's, like an apocalyptic thing from his perspective, but it's like, we should be leading the way here, right? And we're kind of second fiddle was his perspective on this. And there's certainly a lot of interesting discussions you can get into with liberation theology and sort of like the intersection of Catholicism and, these various movements throughout the world and throughout Latin America. But I don't want to get too into the weeds there. We've already gone comfortably over an hour, I believe.
And then moving forward, we're getting closer. So he's a cardinal now. And we can talk a little bit about that.
Honestly, it's interesting because usually I'm seeing all sorts of stuff pop up, more readily accessible once someone's a cardinal. And I know there's, different things out there, but honestly, I think perhaps because he's been so open with a lot of his earlier life and, is very willing to give interviews and talk to folks, I think there's more that we see, or at least that when I look into these cardinals, right, for cardinal numbers, I'm used to that being fairly scant until they get higher up the ladder. But in Pope Francis's case, it almost seemed to go the other direction. Like, yes, you can tell, once he's a cardinal, he's continuing to administer his diocese as he had been, right? With that focus on, the poor and the suffering. He would start to do like Holy Thursday, the washing of the feet, one of the funkiest rituals in modern Catholicism, because you got to say modern, because there are some really funky rituals in historical Catholicism. But the washing of the feet is that was the one where I invited a non-Catholic friend. I was like, hey, do you want to go ahead and check out what's going on here? He's like, sure. Yeah. He's like, interested in all religions, that sort of vibe. And so we're like, okay, well, we'll go ahead and check it out. I hadn't thought about the fact that it was Holy Thursday. And so, suddenly these people are taking their shoes off on the altar, and I'm sitting there like mortified. I'm like, I promise it's not usually like this. He's like, oh no, this is great. This is exactly what I was hoping for, right? But in any case, enough about Sean. Pope Francis, when he was, Cardinal Bergoglio, would also use that moment, that ceremony, right? That humilification, I guess, of the presiding, cardinal or later pope of the ceremony, the one who's actually washing the feet. He made sure that he did that ceremony, at jails, in hospitals, in nursing homes, in slums, just to kind of reach out to the outcast. And, you could sort of tell, just reminding people who, in his opinion, the church is supposed to be serving. So that was one aspect. There was media rumor around Pope Francis is something that was not new with his papacy. So, for example, Argentina, when he was cardinal, had, kind of that moment where they were looking at civil unions for homosexual couples. And, initially, it seems Pope Francis was opposed, at least publicly, but there was certainly a lot of chatter that, behind closed doors, he was maybe willing to see it as a compromise, and basically in order to avoid having full-on gay marriage, he's like, well, maybe we can do this civil unions that the church can, sign off on. But it's not something that ultimately shook out. But that was something that was sort of a persistent rumor that had been, sort of the closed door discussions of Cardinal Francis. I remember that was something that popped up relatively early on in the discussions after his elevation.
You can see a lot of those things, though, that he's made a point of. We're all building up in his career. This issue with the Latin Mass, which I think maybe people outside of who aren't Catholics or who aren't following the Catholic Church, what a big deal that is.
Yeah, it's the most inside baseball of topics, but it is very much a topic, right? And it's the classic, papal history drama where you have sort of the back and forth across multiple papacies. And there's definitely a reversal on that front, going from Pope Benedict to Pope Francis. Now, interestingly, that was an area where I was pretty surprised, because it turns out when Pope Benedict, kind of reinstated or, encouraged the use of the Latin Mass, Pope Francis actually, Cardinal Bergoglio was ostensibly on board with that, right? He assigned, a priest to kind of enhance that access to the extraordinary form, is what it's called at this point, the Old Latin Mass, if you want to, just take the rough and ready layman's terms. But, he did sign off and approve that. And maybe that's why, he's got some leeway from the traditionalists, but also this is the same person who, as Pope, would certainly about face on that, if that's where he was at the time as a cardinal. I get the sense that it was sort of a, look, if the Pope is telling me to do a thing, I'm going to do the thing, right? It's that that general obedience churchmen at least expect from other people, even if they don't always necessarily give it themselves.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors. And the push and the pull between this local phenomenon of the Latin Mass, which is not would you say it's not a massive, each diocese might have a parish or two that does it, and they might not do it exclusively, but then it's real focus on this idea of synodality that a lot of things in like Vatican I and Vatican II were getting away from synodality. He's going back to it, of this focus on the local.
Yes. Yeah. The focus on the local is certainly, and this definitely does lead into his papacy, and especially, the last, I would say 5 years with the synod on synodality. It's been a process where it's like, okay, well, what is the concrete result? Like, you still have folks that say like, okay, what is synodality? Go ahead and tell us in a nutshell. Like, we've been talking about this for 5 years. Like, what is it? Well, I mean, as you know, I don't really need to tell you this, but, a synod is a meeting of bishops, right? And it's kind of working together. It's in non-church terms, you might say collegiality, right? It's, it's sort of that working together. But also Pope Francis, is willing to take it even to a higher level, because not only is he, this slum bishop who's out, willing to reach out to those in the slums, but he also does seem to, want to make a point of bringing them in, right, to the conversation and having the church be for them. He's very fond of saying like, we want a church todos for everyone. And so, with this synod on synodality, he'll bring in, shock and scandal, women, for example, obviously not bishops, but, voting roles in this synod, and then priests and lay people as well. So certainly an expansive, project, but it's an interesting one because since it's designed to promote sort of that bottom up, governing structure, he's not really, well, okay, this is debatable. And now we are getting into the contemporary, which is fine. I do enjoy talking about this, but, there are times where you can definitely see him, putting more than one finger on the scale, shall we say. So for example, fiducia supplicans, right? The informal blessing of homosexual individuals, right? That was something that theoretically the Synod on Synodality was supposed to talk about and study. And then it came out with this document, and it was sort of like, well, here's your conclusion. Now go ahead and, kind of study what to do with it.
So, work your way backwards from that.
Yeah. I mean, that's classic poping, but not exactly, what the ostensible plan was. I'm not going to say, I'm opposed to that, conclusion personally, but at the same time, it was something where I was like, oh, well, that's an interesting way to go about synodality. But I will say, in the end, it did shake out in a very interesting way because the African bishops as a whole, right, their Episcopal conferences got together and they decided, well, we're not actually going to implement this papal document in the entire continent of Africa. And, you look at papal history and, how do you think that's going to play out? Well, in this case, Pope Francis said, okay. And that's been left to be, which really, if we're talking about people who might have some interest in a future conclave, Cardinal Mbongo Basungu is the one who kind of coordinated that. I think he's from Ghana, I want to say. I don't have my notes on him up, but it was interesting that shook out without drama, apart from just an entire continent saying, yeah, we're actually not going to listen to you, Holy Father. So, yeah.
He's also largely punted on the issue of female ordination, female deaconesses and a diaconate and clergy whatsoever, which I find interesting. It really hasn't come up at all as a major issue, and he seems to have. I don't know how to. Punting isn't quite the right word, but he also hasn't drawn a hard line against it. It just has become kind of a non-issue. The Greek Orthodox Church in Africa has made a female deacon before the Catholic Church, which I would not have probably have called that.
Yeah, no, that was extremely eyebrow raising when that happened. I don't have the details on that one in particular. I was kind of surprised it did not make much of the news. I just saw it on Michael Lofton, I think was the one person I saw, kind of commenting on that. But I will say punting, I think, is a fair enough term. It's an interesting mix, right? Because when it comes to women's ordination, Pope Francis has said on, a few occasions, like, this is, a settled matter. Go ahead and see John Paul II. But then he also says, like, women deacons, like, deacons aren't necessarily ordained 100%. Like, historically, it's kind of hard to argue very firmly against female deacons because they come up in the New Testament. Like, St. Paul gives a shout out to a female deacon in one of his letters in the New Testament. Like, that's there. So, like, there's the word, the female word for deaconess in Greece. I forget in Greek. I forget what the term actually is, but, it's present in the New Testament. So that's kind of hard to ignore. But at the same time, he's had multiple commissions on female deacons that, they'll go for a few years and, we're told that their final report is going to be ready at this time and then never actually see the final report. And then, a couple of years later, they announce a new commission and same thing. And so it's just kind of like, it's there. There's a pot. I would certainly not say it's boiling away, but there's water in it. There's a heat source under it. So it's just kind of there in the background. I do think part of his strategy, it seems to me, in terms of that pressure, right, is he seems to have a bit of an escape valve. And by a bit, I mean like pretty massive, because he has made pretty concrete action outside of the diaconate and ordination for women. Because if you look at the different roles in the Vatican, he has certainly been elevating various women to these high posts. Sister Raffaella Petrini, right, is a woman, obviously a nun. I'm calling her a sister. She's not my sister. She's a nun, who is now effectively the prime minister of the Vatican, right? She's the head of the secular government of that city-state. And that was an interesting one, just because with the timing of the appointment and its effective date, like when he was having his health crisis, I was wondering if, that was actually going to be something that actually took effect, if it was going to be one of those big what ifs of history, because if he had, passed, which he very well could have, before we got to March when the appointment took effect, it would have lapsed. She would not be, officially in that role. And, I could certainly see people, potentially say like, oh, well, that was God saying that was a step too far, right? But at some point, it's going to be someone's last act, right? So that's, he's very aware of his own mortality. It does seem like he has accelerated some of his envelope pushing and really gotten fully into his plans since the death of Pope Benedict. I'm not going to say he was, holding him back, but I'm going to imply that just in the sense of like, wanting to be respectful to, his predecessor and, sort of that collegiality, right? He doesn't generally seem to enjoy stepping out on his own initiative, but also he does know how to do that. We saw that with Fiducia Supplicans. Ultimately, we do, at least as far as I can tell, we do see that with the appointment of women in increasingly higher up Vatican positions, like Sister Petrini. Her post, somewhat eyebrow-raisingly for my special interest, is the post that historically has always been held by cardinals. So, that raises the question of, could we see a cardinal as the next step? Because, even, right when Pope Francis was first elected, one of the first things that I definitely took some notes on, because this was very eyebrow raising for me at the time. Like, you don't have to be male to be a cardinal. It's not an ordained role. It's, they're the people who elect the Pope, right? It's kind of a ceremonial role, but it does have historically a lot of connections there, right? With ordinations, right? There's a reason they're called cardinal bishops, cardinal priests, cardinal deacons, right? There is certainly connections there. But, we have it from the official Vatican spokesman that it is a possibility that the woman could be in that role. And then here you have, a woman, or really at this point, multiple women in roles that would traditionally be held by cardinals. Then again, Pope Francis likes to surprise, and it certainly seems like, if there's a role that's a slam dunk case for having a cardinal's hat, like the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, although I do think the current one is a cardinal, but I think it's Milan, maybe Venice as well, two large dioceses that always could count on the red hat. Like, they literally were so ingrained in that role that they even had, at one point, I think there's like a right to wear a cardinal's clothes even before you get actually the red hat, because they were just like, why do we need to wait for it to be official? We'll just be the patriarchal, see, effectively in the West. Those sees aren't necessarily getting the red hats like they used to. So, maybe Pope Francis is going to defy expectations here, and while he's giving these roles, he's not going to follow through with what you would assume for the president of the Vatican city-state.
Well, I found that this is a fascinating topic. We've scratched the surface, but I think that we've given a really well-rounded look at Pope Francis. Thank you so much, Greg, for coming on the show. And I feel we'll have many more opportunities for collaboration in the future. And where can we find your show?
Yeah. So thank you, Steve. It's been a fulfillment of quite a few years of, just thinking about it and kind of, just sort of a little bit arm's length. So I appreciate you, being responsive and, willing to have me on. Bottom line, Popeular History is the name of my flagship show. I'm looking at, potentially having the Cardinal Numbers Project that I mentioned as a spinoff. I might do something with papal elections with a brief from Pontifex that recently got a boost because we actually got interviewed by NPR at one point. I don't think it's going to see the light of day because Pope Francis didn't pass. So they've had more time to find people with more credentials. Not that we don't know our stuff, but Habemus Poinsam is something that we had been talking about. And it's been on the tail end of the Pontifex promos. And he actually explicitly asked about that. So when is that coming? And I was like, in my head, I'm like, this is basically vaporware at this point, right? This is not something that I still keep it rolling in the back of my mind, but now the pressure's on now that I said I'd do it this year. So we'll see if that actually comes together. But so Popeular History, that's Popeular. So it's the nice Pope pun. I'm honestly shocked that I hadn't seen anyone else take that one. So whatever, I'm rolling with it. At this point, I could say I got it first, I think, comfortably.
Well, thank you again, and definitely tune in, and we will talk to you next time.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve.
Historical Jesus Podcast is the sweeping saga of the life and times of Galilean Jesus of Nazareth, as well as the faith, religion, and church founded to honor and disseminate his acts and teachings. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this fascinating journey through time, exploring the many great works of Christian theology, literature, architecture, music, and art inspired by the words and deeds of Jesus Christ.